In the heart of the city, beneath towering chandeliers and polished marble floors, a grand funeral hall filled with a sea of mourners dressed in somber black. The air was heavy with whispered condolences and the rustle of silk and satin. Crystal caskets glistened beneath soft spotlights, and floral arrangements in shades of white and pale lavender created a fragile, serene atmosphere. Yet beneath this facade of solemnity, an undercurrent of tension rippled through the room like a barely contained storm. Amid the crowd, a tall figure moved with quiet purpose, cutting through clusters of grieving acquaintances with a presence that was both familiar and unsettling. Ethan Langston's sharp gaze swept over the faces around him. Distant relatives, business associates, and family friends, none of whom expected his arrival. The years of absence had created a gap, a void filled with unspoken grievances and cold memories. Yet here he was, stepping back into the world he had left behind, drawn by the finality of his father's passing. The millionaire patriarch, Victor Langston, had been the embodiment of success and power, a man whose influence had shaped industries and whose name commanded respect even in the most exclusive circles. His death, sudden yet quietly anticipated by some, had sent ripples through the city's elite. Now, as the mourners gathered to pay their respects, the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of cold formality and underlying unease. Ethan's footsteps echoed softly as he approached the front of the hall, where the family had reserved a section of plush velvet seats. His presence was met with subtle glances, some curious, others wary. The staff, ever loyal yet distant, maintained their composure, careful not to betray the undercurrent of whispered conversations that followed in Ethan's wake. Their eyes flickered briefly with recognition, but no words were exchanged. The air between Ethan and the staff was taut, a silent acknowledgment of the years and wounds that had passed. At the center of the gathering stood the casket, adorned with an array of white lilies and orchids, resting beneath a portrait of Victor Langston, a stern yet dignified man in his prime, captured in a moment of quiet reflection. Beside the casket, Victor's second wife, Margaret, stood poised and composed, her carefully arranged auburn hair and tailored black dress a stark contrast to the palpable grief around her. Margaret's eyes flicked toward Ethan as he took his place among the mourners, her lips tightening imperceptibly. Nearby, the family's trusted lawyer, Stephen Caldwell, maintained a discreet watch over the proceedings. His sharp features and steely demeanor suggested a man accustomed to navigating the treacherous waters of wealth and power. He exchanged brief nods with Margaret, their alliance unspoken yet evident. Ethan's gaze drifted over the hall, taking in the familiar faces that had once been part of his life, and the new ones that had filled the void during his absence. Despite the veneer of respect, he sensed the undercurrents of suspicion and resentment. The years had not been kind to the bonds that once tied them together. As the ceremony began, the officiant's voice rose in measured tones, offering prayers and reflections on a life well lived. Yet Ethan's mind was elsewhere, circling around memories of a fractured past and the unresolved tensions that had driven him away. The cold formality of the event only deepened the ache in his chest, a reminder of the chasm between him and the father whose funeral he now attended. His thoughts flickered back to the last time he had seen Victor, a confrontation steeped in bitterness and betrayal over a dispute that had severed their relationship. The years that followed had been marked by silence and avoidance, a chasm filled with unspoken regrets and unanswered questions. Now, standing here amid the muted sobs and respectful nods, Ethan felt the weight of that history pressing down on him. The mourners began to file past the casket, offering their final respects. Ethan's hand lingered at his side, clenched tightly into a fist as if holding back a flood of emotions. He approached the casket slowly, his eyes fixed on the polished wood and the stillness within. The man who had been his father lay silent and distant, a figure both revered and feared. Nearby, Margaret observed Ethan with a guarded expression, her posture rigid as if bracing for a confrontation she hoped to avoid. Stephen stood discreetly by her side, his calculated gaze flickering between Ethan and the other mourners. The tension was palpable, a fragile web stretched thin by years of mistrust and unspoken conflicts. As the ceremony drew to a close, Ethan found himself alone for a moment near the grand window that overlooked the city skyline. The twilight cast long shadows across his face, revealing the conflict etched deep within his eyes. He had returned not just to mourn, but to confront the legacy left behind. A legacy tangled in power, betrayal, and a family fractured beyond repair. A soft voice interrupted his reverie. Ethan called a familiar figure from behind. It was Julia, the family's longtime housekeeper, whose loyalty had remained steadfast despite the distance between father and son. Her eyes held a mixture of sympathy and unspoken apology. "It's been a long time." Ethan nodded, the mask of stoicism faltering for a brief moment. "Too long," he replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. She offered a small, understanding smile. "Your father, he always hoped you'd come back. Maybe now that he's gone, there's a chance to mend what was broken." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility and regret. Ethan looked out once more at the city below, the place that had shaped his family's fortune and fractured its bonds. He knew that his return was only the beginning, a step into a world where old wounds would be reopened and buried secrets threatened to surface. As the final guests departed and the hall's grandeur dimmed into night, Ethan stood alone amidst the fading echoes of the funeral. The millionaire's son, once estranged and forgotten, had returned not just to mourn a father, but to face the shadows that lingered long after death. Outside, the city lights flickered like distant stars, indifferent to the turmoil within. Yet for Ethan Langston, the night held a promise, a chance to unravel the uneasy peace and confront the truths that lay buried beneath the polished surface of wealth and legacy. The night had settled heavily over the Langston estate, its grand silhouette etched against the distant city lights like a monument to a past that refused to fade. Inside the dimly lit study, the air was thick with the scent of aged leather and polished wood, the walls lined with rows of books whose spines bore the weight of history and secrets. Ethan stood alone, the shadows of flickering candlelight dancing across his face as memories surged unbidden, transporting him to a time when the estate had been filled with laughter and warmth, before bitterness had taken root. The fracture between him and his father had been more than a simple disagreement. It was a chasm carved by years of misunderstanding and the relentless pursuit of power. Ethan remembered vividly the bitter dispute over the family inheritance, a battle that had fractured their bond beyond repair. Victor Langston had been a man consumed by legacy, his vision rigid and unyielding, while Ethan had sought a path defined by his own principles and dreams. Their clash had been inevitable, a collision of wills that left scars both visible and concealed. In the quiet solitude of the study, Ethan's mind drifted to the figures who had shaped that turbulent chapter. Margaret, Victor's second wife, had entered the family like a calculated storm. Her presence was commanding, her smile often a mask concealing motives as sharp as the tailored suit she wore. She had quickly established herself, not only as the mistress of the estate, but as a formidable force within the family's intricate power dynamics. Ethan had never trusted her. In his eyes, she was a shadow cast over his father's final years, a catalyst in a widening rift. The memory of Margaret's cold greetings haunted him, those measured words laced with subtle condescension during family gatherings and board meetings alike. She had navigated the corridors of power with a grace that belied the ruthlessness beneath, and Ethan's absence had only allowed her influence to grow unchecked. Now, standing once again under the same roof, he felt the weight of her scrutiny as if the very walls whispered of her quiet dominion. Beside Margaret stood Stephen Caldwell, the family's trusted lawyer. Ethan recalled their interactions, formal, guarded, and always tinged with an undercurrent of negotiation. Stephen was a man who understood the language of wealth and control, his loyalty pledged not to family, but to the preservation of the estate's vast fortunes. His presence at Victor's side had been constant in recent years, a confidant and advisor whose counsel often steered decisions that Ethan had come to question. The lawyer's inscrutable gaze now seemed to pierce through the layers of grief, assessing and calculating the unfolding drama. Ethan's fingers brushed against the edge of a faded photograph resting on the study's mahogany desk, a family portrait taken years before the estrangement. In it, a younger Victor stood proudly beside Margaret, his arm around her waist, while Ethan's own smile appeared tentative, caught between the hope of reconciliation and the shadow of impending conflict. The image was a stark reminder of what had been lost. The echoes of arguments past filled the room as Ethan's thoughts unraveled the timeline of their fallout. The dispute over the inheritance had begun innocuously enough, with Victor's plans to restructure the family business and adjust his will to include Margaret more prominently. Ethan had perceived these moves as betrayals, a sidelining of his own place in the legacy he believed was rightfully his. Heated words had been exchanged, accusations of greed, loyalty questioned, and a chasm widened by pride and pain. The final straw had come during a meeting in Victor's private office, where Ethan had confronted his father with demand for transparency and respect. Victor's response had been cold and unyielding, a declaration that family loyalty was conditional and that the empire would be preserved at any cost. The bitterness of that moment lingered, a fossilized wound that time had failed to heal. Now, as Ethan stood in the quiet aftermath of his father's passing, he sensed that the true story of those final years remained obscured. The narratives told by Margaret and Stephen were polished and rehearsed, tailored to preserve their own positions. Yet beneath the surface, Ethan suspected that all was not as it seemed. The estate, the business, and the family were entangled in webs of secrecy, and the rift between him and Victor was only one thread in a larger tapestry of deception. His resolve hardened. He would not allow the version of events controlled by Margaret and Stephen to define his father's legacy or his own future. The memory of his father's stern gaze, mingled with the bitterness of their last encounter, fueled a determination to uncover the truth. Ethan knew that to do so, he would have to navigate the treacherous waters of family politics, where alliances shifted like shadows and trust was a rare commodity. A soft knock at the door drew Ethan's attention. Julia, the steadfast housekeeper, entered quietly, her eyes reflecting a blend of sympathy and caution. "Mr. Langston," she said gently, "there are people asking for you downstairs. Family and others." Ethan nodded, steeling himself. "I'm ready." As he descended the grand staircase, the atmosphere shifted. The once familiar halls now felt charged with unspoken tensions. Family members exchanged guarded glances, their conversations hushed but fraught with meaning. Margaret greeted him with a measured smile, her eyes calculating, while Stephen remained close by, his demeanor unreadable. Ethan's gaze met Margaret's for a brief moment, and in that silent exchange, a challenge was issued, a silent battle for control over the narrative that would shape what came next. The gathering that followed was a muted dance of civility and veiled hostility. Business associates and distant relatives filled the room, their conversations orbiting around the legacy of Victor Langston and the future of the empire he had built. Yet beneath the polished veneer, Ethan sensed the fractures and loyalties at play. Whispers hinted at decisions made behind closed doors, and the subtle exclusion of Ethan during critical moments lingered like a shadow. Amid this, Ethan felt the weight of his own estrangement keenly. The years of absence had left him an outsider in his own family's affairs, a fact not lost on those who had filled the void. His return was met with skepticism, some questioning his motives, others wary of the disruption he represented. But Ethan's presence was more than a mere return. It was a quiet declaration that he was reclaiming his place. The wounds of the past would not be swept aside, and the truth, however uncomfortable, would find its way to light. As the night deepened, Ethan found himself once again in the study, the flicker of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. The weight of the evening pressed upon him, yet beneath it all, a spark of hope kindled. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with obstacles and old wounds. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt the stirrings of purpose. He reached for the family ledger, its pages thick with records and secrets, and opened it deliberately. The story of the Langston legacy was far from complete, and Ethan was ready to write its next chapter, one that would confront the ghosts of the past and seek the truth behind the facade. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change. Inside, the Langston estate stood silent yet alive, a monument to power, betrayal, and the fragile hope of reconciliation. The morning light seeped through the heavy drapes of Victor Langston's private study, casting long beams across the scattered papers and leather-bound volumes that cluttered the mahogany desk. Ethan sat hunched over the remnants of his father's belongings, each item a fragment of a life abruptly ended yet shrouded in mystery. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of aged cedar, but amid the quiet, a sense of restless energy pulsed beneath the surface, a restless energy born of unanswered questions and half-truths. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as they sifted through a stack of documents and photographs, seeking some clue that might illuminate the shadows surrounding Victor's final days. It was then that his gaze landed on a worn leather envelope, tucked carefully beneath a faded photograph. The envelope bore no markings save for his name, written in his father's unmistakable hand. His heart quickened. The discovery was unexpected, a secret message concealed beneath the layers of routine and formality. He slid the envelope open with deliberate care, the paper crackling softly in the stillness. Inside, a letter lay folded, its edges yellowed by time, but preserved with evident care. As he unfolded it, the neat script revealed words that seemed to reach across the chasm between life and death. "Ethan," it began, "if you are reading this, then fate has brought you back to a path I once feared was lost. There is much I never said, much I wished to explain before the silence took hold. The years between us have been heavy with regret, but my hope is that this letter might serve as a bridge, however fragile, between what was and what might still be." The letter spoke of reconciliation, of a desire to mend fractured bonds, and to entrust Ethan with a truth that had remained hidden from the family and the world. Victor's words carried a weight of sincerity and vulnerability that caught Ethan off guard, a stark contrast to the cold, distant man he remembered from their last encounter. As he read on, the letter hinted at troubles that had plagued Victor in his final years, whispers of threats, of decisions made under duress, and a deep concern for the safety of those he loved. There was a plea for understanding, a confession that not all was as it seemed within the walls of the Langston estate. Ethan's eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and hope. The letter was a lifeline thrown from the past, pulling him into a web of secrets he was only beginning to grasp. It challenged the narrative he had held onto for years, the narrative of betrayal and abandonment, and invited him to look deeper. His mind raced with questions. Why had Victor concealed these truths? Who had forced his hand? And what dangers lurked beneath the polished surface of the family's public image? Determined to uncover the full story, Ethan carefully folded the letter and placed it into his pocket. There was no time to waste in idle speculation. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. His resolve was soon tested. A knock at the door broke the silence, and Julia, the loyal housekeeper, entered with a cautious expression. "Mr. Langston," she said softly, "someone is here to see you. A private investigator, Mr. Harris. He says he comes at your request." Ethan's brow furrowed in surprise. He had not yet arranged for help, but the urgency of the moment made the offer timely. "Send him in," he replied, rising from the desk. Moments later, the door opened to reveal a man in his mid-30s, sharp-eyed and composed, dressed in a tailored suit that suggested professionalism and discretion. He extended his hand with quiet confidence. "Ethan Langston?" the man asked. "Yes," Ethan answered, shaking his hand firmly. "Aimetan. Thank you for coming." The investigator nodded. "I understand you're looking into the circumstances surrounding your father's death. I've been following some irregularities that may be connected. If you're willing, I can share what I've found." Ethan motioned for him to sit, curiosity and caution mingling in his expression. As the investigator laid out his findings, a complex picture emerged: financial inconsistencies in the family business, unexplained transfers of funds, and secret meetings held in the dead of night. The threads hinted at a conspiracy far more intricate than Ethan had imagined. One name kept surfacing in the documents: Stephen Caldwell, the family lawyer. His involvement in these clandestine dealings was subtle but unmistakable. The realization sent a chill through Ethan. The man he had regarded as a neutral party might hold the key to unlocking the truth, or might be part of the very deception he sought to unravel. Ethan's thoughts returned to Margaret, whose poised demeanor masked ambitions that now seemed more dangerous in light of these revelations. Together, Stephen and Margaret formed a nexus of power that had operated in the shadows, manipulating events to their advantage. The investigator's voice cut through Ethan's spiraling thoughts. "There's more," he said gravely. "I've also discovered that your father received threats shortly before his death, anonymous warnings to step back from certain projects. It seems Victor was entangled in something that made him a target." Ethan clenched his jaw, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. His father's final years had been a battleground, fought not only within the family, but against forces unknown. The letter, the threats, the financial irregularities, all pointed toward a hidden war waged in silence. As the meeting concluded, Ethan felt a surge of determination. The path ahead would be perilous, but the letter had awakened a new hope within him, a hope that the truth could be uncovered and that reconciliation was possible, even if delayed. He rose, thanking the investigator, and watched as the man departed into the fading afternoon light. Alone once more in the study, Ethan unfolded the letter again, the words echoing in his mind. The bridge to his father's heart was fragile, but it was there, and he would cross it. Setting the letter carefully aside, Ethan turned toward the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun dipped low. The shadows were long, but so too was the promise of dawn. The study's heavy oak door creaked softly as Ethan pushed it open, stepping inside the sanctum that had remained locked and untouched since his father's passing. The room was a repository of secrets, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and the polished brass of antique instruments, all bathed in the muted glow of afternoon light filtering through stained glass. The air held a faint musk of aged paper and polished wood, mingling with the subtle scent of cigar smoke, Victor's lingering presence woven into every corner. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, immediately drawn to the imposing desk at its center, cluttered with stacks of documents, unopened envelopes, and a small assortment of locked drawers. The sight stirred a familiar mix of curiosity and unease within him. For years, Victor's private study had been off-limits, a fortress of solitude and mystery. Today, it was Ethan's gateway to truths long concealed. He approached the desk, fingers tracing the carved edges as if searching for guidance. His gaze settled on a small, ornate box, its surface etched with intricate patterns, locked tight and seemingly innocuous. Intrigued, Ethan set about searching for keys, opening drawers, and rifling through papers until a worn leather pouch revealed a small, tarnished key. His pulse quickened as he inserted it into the lock, the mechanism clicking open with a satisfying ease. Inside the box lay a bundle of letters and documents, bound together with a faded ribbon. Ethan untied the bundle carefully, revealing a trove of papers that hinted at a hidden life his father had led, one far removed from the polished image the world had known. Among the letters were correspondences with charitable organizations, detailed reports on philanthropic projects, and financial records indicating substantial donations to causes that had never been publicly acknowledged. The revelation unsettled Ethan. Victor Langston, the formidable businessman, had harbored a secret passion for philanthropy, a facet of his life carefully shielded from the scrutiny of family and society. These documents painted a portrait of a man striving to effect change beyond the confines of wealth and power, a man who had sought redemption or perhaps solace in acts of generosity. But amid the benevolent records, Ethan's attention was captured by a series of cryptic notes, handwritten entries in Victor's precise script, referencing meetings with unnamed individuals and coded references to Project Dawn. The notes were terse yet urgent, hinting at a venture shrouded in secrecy and fraught with risk. Ethan's mind raced to piece together the puzzle. What was Project Dawn? Why had Victor kept it hidden from everyone, including his own family? And could it be connected to the threats his father had received in recent months? Before he could delve deeper, a soft noise from behind startled him. He spun around to find Julia, the housekeeper, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Her eyes held a mixture of sympathy and caution. "Mr. Langston," she said softly, "there are calls for you downstairs. Some of the staff are uneasy. They've noticed strange visitors coming and going. There's concern about what's happening here." Ethan nodded, the unease in her voice mirroring his own growing suspicion. "Thank you, Julia. I'll be down shortly." Once alone again, Ethan gathered the documents, tucking the most sensitive papers into a leather satchel. The pieces of his father's hidden life were beginning to coalesce into a narrative that challenged everything he had believed. He moved toward the tall bookcase that lined one wall, noting the faint outline of a seam in the wood, a concealed door. His heart quickened as he pressed gently, triggering a mechanism that swung the shelf open to reveal a narrow passage leading into darkness. Steeling himself, Ethan stepped inside, the air growing cooler and the corridor narrowing as he ventured deeper. The passage opened into a small, dimly lit room lined with metal cabinets and safes, their surfaces cold to the touch. Here lay the heart of Victor's secrets, a vault of information and artifacts concealed from the outside world. Ethan approached a large safe embedded in the wall, its keypad blinking faintly in the low light. Drawing from memory, he entered the combination he had glimpsed in his father's notes. The lock clicked open, revealing folders filled with documents detailing financial transactions, confidential correspondence, and encrypted files stored on a flash drive. As he sifted through the materials, a chilling realization took hold. The documents contained evidence suggesting that Victor's death might not have been natural, as the public had been led to believe. Reports of irregularities in the company's accounts, threats from unknown adversaries, and a trail of communications hinting at coercion painted a picture of a man under siege. One file, marked urgent, contained a letter addressed to Victor from an anonymous source, its tone veiled but unmistakably menacing. The writer warned Victor to cease his involvement in Project Dawn or face dire consequences. The letter was dated just weeks before Victor's sudden decline and eventual death. Ethan's hands trembled as he absorbed the implications. His father's passing, once thought to be the result of natural causes, now loomed under a shadow of suspicion. The carefully constructed narrative of illness and age was unraveling, revealing a darker truth lurking beneath. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily upon him. He realized that the fight for the Langston legacy was far from over. Beneath the opulence and power lay treachery and danger, and the man he had lost had been battling forces that threatened not only his life, but the future of everything he had built. Ethan replaced the documents carefully, sealing the safe and closing the hidden door behind him. As he emerged from the secret chamber, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the study, mirroring the growing darkness in his thoughts. He knew that to honor his father's memory, he would have to delve deeper into the mystery, to confront the hidden enemies and unravel the truth behind Project Dawn. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but the legacy of Victor Langston demanded nothing less. In the quiet of the study, surrounded by the echoes of the past, Ethan steeled himself for the battle to come. The secrets he had uncovered were only the beginning, and the true story of his father's final days awaited revelation. The evening descended over the Langston estate like a velvet curtain, dimming the grand halls and muting the echoes of the day's revelations. Ethan sat in the quiet of the drawing room, the flickering fire casting shadows across his resolute face. The weight of the hidden truths he had uncovered pressed heavily upon him, leaving no room for hesitation. To unravel the tangled web that had ensnared his father, He needed help, expertise beyond his own, a guide through the labyrinth of deceit and danger that now defined his quest. His thoughts settled on the investigator who had arrived unannounced, whose keen insights had already begun to illuminate the shadows. Ethan reached for his phone and dialed the number he had saved, his fingers steady despite the storm of uncertainty beneath. The line rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. "Mr. Langston," the investigator greeted. "I was hoping to hear from you. I need your help," Ethan said without preamble. "There's more to my father's death than meets the eye. I want to get to the bottom of it." Minutes later, the investigator, Harris, arrived at the estate, his demeanor purposeful and unyielding. Their meeting took place in the hushed privacy of the library, where stacks of books formed an imposing backdrop to the unfolding investigation. Harris spread out the documents he had gathered, financial statements, transaction records, and a series of encrypted emails that painted a picture of clandestine dealings and whispered betrayals. "These discrepancies," he explained, "suggest that someone within your father's inner circle was siphoning funds and manipulating company decisions for personal gain." Ethan's eyes narrowed as he studied the evidence. "Stephen Caldwell," he said, naming the family lawyer whose presence had become increasingly suspect. "He's been involved in every major decision recently, often behind closed doors." Harris nodded. "He's a key player. But there's more. Meetings held at odd hours, communications with unknown parties, and financial transfers to accounts offshore. Whoever's behind this is careful, but not careful enough." The gravity of the situation settled over Ethan like a shroud. The man who had been his father's trusted advisor might have been orchestrating the very schemes that had led to Victor's downfall. The betrayal cut deep, fueling a resolve that burned away the remnants of grief and doubt. As the investigation deepened, Harris uncovered a series of secret meetings between Stephen and Margaret Langston, Victor's widow. Their alliance, once hidden behind smiles and polite conversation, now revealed itself as a calculated partnership aimed at consolidating control over the family empire. Ethan's bitterness began to give way to a focused determination. The years of estrangement, the cold silences, and the fractured memories transformed into a singular purpose: to expose the truth and reclaim what had been stolen. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Harris presented a breakthrough. "I found a ledger," he said, sliding a thick file across the table. "It documents unauthorized transfers and payments linked directly to Stephen and Margaret. This is the proof we need." Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he thumbed through the pages, the evidence undeniable. The betrayal was not just personal, it was criminal. Their work extended beyond financial records. Harris had uncovered whispers of threats and intimidation aimed at Victor in his final months, a campaign designed to silence and control. The realization that his father had been under siege from within his own circle sharpened Ethan's resolve. But the path forward was fraught with danger. The conspirators were powerful, their reach extensive, and their willingness to protect their interests ruthless. Ethan understood that confronting them would require more than evidence. It would require strategy, allies, and unwavering courage. As days passed, Ethan found himself shedding the bitterness that had once consumed him. The quest to uncover the truth demanded clarity and focus, leaving no room for resentment. He began to see himself not as a victim of the past, but as a guardian of his father's legacy and principles. The investigation also revealed fractures within the family's loyal staff. Some had been complicit in the schemes, while others remained steadfast in their allegiance to Ethan and the true spirit of the Langston name. Navigating these divided loyalties became a delicate balancing act, one that required patience and discernment. One afternoon, Ethan met privately with Julia, the longtime housekeeper whose loyalty had never wavered. Her quiet strength and knowledge of the household's inner workings provided invaluable insight. "There's more going on than you know," she confided. "People whisper in the shadows, and not all are who they seem." Her words reinforced Ethan's understanding that the battle ahead was not just legal or financial. It was deeply personal, entangled with the very fabric of trust and betrayal that defined the Langston family. With Harris's guidance, Ethan mapped out a plan to gather further evidence and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. They would need to move carefully, exposing the truth without alerting those who had much to lose. Late into the night, Ethan reviewed the files, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. The investigation had revealed a web of deceit far more complex than he had imagined, implicating those closest to his father and to him. Yet amid the uncertainty, a newfound clarity emerged. The truth, no matter how painful, was a path toward justice and redemption. Ethan was ready to walk it, armed with resolve and the support of those who believed in the Langston legacy. As dawn approached, Ethan stood by the window, watching the first light touch the estate's sprawling grounds. The journey ahead would be perilous, but the spark of hope kindled within him was brighter than ever. With each step, he moved closer to unraveling the secrets that had haunted his family, and to reclaiming the future that was rightfully his. The grand dining room of the Langston estate was bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished silverware and gleaming china set meticulously for the evening's gathering. The room, once a place of celebration and familial warmth, now felt charged with a taut tension, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Around the long mahogany table sat the key figures of the family, their faces masks of civility concealing currents of unease that rippled beneath the surface. Ethan entered the room with measured steps, his presence commanding attention despite the formal ambience. His gaze swept across the assembled guests. Margaret Langston, poised and composed, her expression carefully neutral. Stephen Caldwell, the family's lawyer, whose steely eyes betrayed a flicker of guarded apprehension, and a scattering of relatives and trusted associates, their whispers hushed, but their curiosity unmistakable. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of discovery and strategy, culminating in this moment where secrets would be confronted and truths laid bare. Ethan's grip on the evidence gathered, the financial records, the correspondence, the carefully documented betrayals, was firm both physically and metaphorically. He had prepared meticulously, knowing that this confrontation could shift the fragile balance of power within the family and beyond. Clearing his throat, Ethan addressed the room with a steady voice that resonated through the silence. Thank you all for coming. Tonight, we face truths that have long been hidden, truths that have shaped the final days of my father and the future of the Langston legacy. Margaret's eyes flickered briefly, a subtle tightening of her lips the only sign of reaction. Stephen remained impassive, his posture rigid, but Ethan sensed the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. I have uncovered evidence, Ethan continued, that reveals a betrayal not only of my father, but of this family. Financial irregularities, secret meetings, and actions taken without the knowledge or consent of the rightful heirs. The very people entrusted with preserving my father's legacy have conspired against him, and against us all. A murmur rippled through the room, quickly stifled by a sharp glance from Margaret. Ethan's gaze locked onto Stephen. You, Stephen Caldwell, have been at the center of this deceit. Your involvement in unauthorized transfers and manipulative schemes cannot be denied. Stephen's eyes narrowed, the thin veneer of composure cracking ever so slightly. These accusations are baseless, he replied, voice smooth but laced with steel. I have acted in the best interests of the family and the company. Ethan shook his head, producing the ledger that detailed the illicit transactions. The evidence tells a different story. You and Margaret have worked together to consolidate control, sidelining rightful heirs and jeopardizing the family's future for personal gain. Margaret's smile was polite but cold. You misunderstand the complexities of managing a vast estate and business, Ethan. Decisions are not always easy, and sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Greater good? Ethan's voice rose, the weight of betrayal fueling his resolve. At what cost? Threats against my father, manipulation of his will, and the undermining of everything he built. These are not sacrifices, they are crimes. The room grew heavier with tension as alliances and truths surfaced. Some relatives shifted uneasily, their loyalties torn between the polished facade and the damning evidence. Margaret's mask faltered for a moment, a flicker of desperation visible before she regained control. "I will not stand for this character assassination," she declared, rising from her seat. "Victor entrusted me with safeguarding his legacy after his passing. Your accusations are nothing but a bitter attempt to rewrite history." Ethan met her gaze unwaveringly. "History will be written by the truth, Margaret, and today that truth is clear." In a calculated move, Stephen interjected, his tone sharp. "If you have evidence, present it formally. This is not the place for theatrics." Ethan nodded, signaling to Harris, the private investigator who had been quietly observing from the side. Harris stepped forward, laying out documents, emails, and financial records with precision and clarity. The room absorbed the weight of the proof, the undeniable trail of deceit and collusion. Margaret's composure cracked further, her voice rising defensively. "You have no proof that my actions were malicious. Everything I have done was with the estate's best interests at heart." Ethan's voice was cold and resolute. "Then explain the anonymous threats to my father, the secret meetings, the unauthorized fund transfers. Explain why he feared for his life in his final months." A silence fell, broken only by the steady ticking of a grandfather clock. The atmosphere was thick with accusation, defense, and the slow unraveling of carefully woven lies. Finally, Margaret's shoulders sagged, the facade crumbling beneath the weight of exposure. "Yes," she admitted, voice trembling but defiant. "I feared losing control. Power brings responsibility, but also enemies. I did what I believed necessary to protect the estate." Her confession sent a shock-wave through the room. The truth laid bare in stark relief. Stephen's expression darkened, and for a moment, the alliance between them seemed fragile. Ethan's response was measured yet firm. "Your fear led to betrayal. My father's death is no longer a mystery, and justice will be served." As the confrontation reached its peak, relatives and associates exchanged glances, the reality of the betrayal settling among them. The carefully constructed image of the Langston family had been shattered, replaced by a raw and painful truth. Ethan felt a surge of both sorrow and resolve. The wounds inflicted by treachery cut deep, but the path to healing and restoration had begun. The evening drew to a close with the promise of legal action and the unmasking of those who had conspired against the family. Ethan's role as the rightful heir and protector of his father's legacy was no longer in question. As he left the dining room, the weight of the confrontation lingered, but so did a newfound clarity. The battle had been fought, and the truth had prevailed, for now. The muted light of early evening filtered through the tall windows of the Langston estate's private conference room, casting elongated shadows across the polished oak table where Ethan sat with a small, determined group. The atmosphere was taut with resolve and cautious hope. After the tumultuous confrontation that had exposed Margaret and Stephen's betrayal, the family's fragile peace had shattered, leaving a void that demanded decisive action. Opposite Ethan sat Stephen Grant, a seasoned family attorney whose reputation for integrity and discretion was well known among the city's elite. Beside him, Harris, the private investigator, leaned forward, his sharp gaze scanning the documents laid out before them. Financial records, correspondence, and surveillance reports that painted a damning portrait of the conspiracy that had threatened to consume the Langston legacy. Ethan's eyes met Stephen's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, their shared commitment to justice now outweighing past rivalries. Where once suspicion had governed their interactions, now an alliance formed, forged in the fires of betrayal and the urgent need to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. "This partnership is essential," Ethan began, his voice steady but edged with determination. "Margaret and Caldwell's actions have endangered everything. We need a united front to dismantle their influence and protect the estate." Stephen nodded thoughtfully. Agreed. I have already begun reviewing the legal avenues available to us. There are grounds for immediate injunctions and civil action, but we must proceed carefully. They'll push back hard. Harris interjected. From an investigative standpoint, we've gathered substantial evidence. Offshore accounts, falsified documents, communications implicating both Margaret and Caldwell in fraudulent activities. But timing and presentation will be critical. We have to ensure the evidence is airtight. Ethan leaned in, absorbing the weight of their counsel. The stakes were high, not just for the fortune or the family name, but for the legacy his father had envisioned. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but the resolve in the room was unshakable. We'll need to coordinate closely, Ethan said. I want a full dossier prepared, with everything we've uncovered. Stephen, you'll handle the legal strategy. Harris, you continue your investigation. I'll manage the family's interests and maintain communication with our allies. A brief silence settled before Stephen spoke again, his tone pragmatic. One thing is clear. We must present a united front. Any sign of division will be exploited by our adversaries. Trust must be rebuilt, not just between us, but within the family and among our supporters. Ethan nodded, the weight of leadership settling firmly on his shoulders. The years of estrangement and bitterness now gave way to a focused mission to restore integrity and reclaim control. As the meeting continued, they mapped out a strategy that balanced legal maneuvers with discreet intelligence gathering. Harris would infiltrate further into the networks surrounding Margaret and Caldwell, seeking witnesses and additional proof. Stephen would prepare motions to freeze assets and initiate proceedings to remove Margaret from any fiduciary positions. Ethan's role would be to rally those within the family and business who had remained loyal, ensuring their support was unwavering. The fractures caused by betrayal would need healing, but the foundation for renewal had to be solid. Later, as the meeting adjourned, Ethan lingered by the window, gazing out at the sprawling estate bathed in twilight. The air was thick with anticipation, the promise of justice mingling with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Julia appeared quietly at his side, her eyes reflecting both concern and hope. "You've taken on a great burden, Mr. Langston," she said softly. "But you're not alone." Ethan offered a faint smile. "I've learned that strength comes from those who stand beside us. This fight isn't just mine, it's ours." The night deepened, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose settled over the estate. Former rivals had become allies, united by a common goal to expose the truth and safeguard the Langston legacy. The journey ahead was uncertain, but together, they had found the resolve to face whatever challenges awaited. As the last light faded, Ethan turned from the window, ready to lead the charge against the conspirators. The battle for justice had entered a new phase, one defined by strategy, unity, and unyielding determination. The grand parlor of the Langston mansion had been transformed into a stage for revelation. Rows of high-backed chairs were arranged meticulously, facing the ornate fireplace where a polished mahogany lectern now stood. The air buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and unease, as family members, business associates, and a handful of trusted confidants gathered under the watchful eyes of the estate staff. The reading of Victor Langston's will, once a mere formality, had become a battleground where truth and deception would collide. Ethan arrived early, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that matched the solemnity of the occasion. His expression was calm, but resolute, tempered by the weight of the past week's discoveries. Beside him stood Stephen Grant, the family lawyer whose steady presence was a source of reassurance. Harris lingered in the back, discreetly observing the room and noting every whispered exchange. Margaret entered shortly after, her composed demeanor belying the storm of emotions she concealed. Stephen Caldwell followed, a faint trace of unease flickering across his features despite his usual stoicism. The atmosphere was charged, a fragile balance teetering on the edge of upheaval. As the guests settled, Ethan stepped forward to the lectern, his voice steady and clear. "Thank you all for gathering here today. In light of recent events, It is important that we approach this reading with transparency and respect for the truth. He gestured to Stephen Grant, who opened the thick leather-bound volume containing Victor's will. The lawyer's fingers traced the pages before he began to read aloud, his tone deliberate and measured. The will outlined the distribution of Victor's vast estate, but as the reading progressed, it became clear that the terms had been revised in the months before his death. Provisions favored Ethan, reaffirming his position as the primary heir and guardian of the family business. Trusts were established to protect assets from mismanagement, and explicit instructions were included to investigate any irregularities in the company's accounts. Margaret's composure faltered momentarily as Stephen detailed these changes, her eyes narrowing slightly. Caldwell sat rigidly, his jaw clenched but silent. Throughout the reading, Ethan's gaze swept the room, noting the subtle shifts in expression among the attendees. Some masked shock, others veiled resentment, but the truth was unfolding before them all. As the final clauses were read, Ethan took a breath and addressed the assembly once more. These revisions reflect my father's intentions, to safeguard the legacy he built and to ensure justice is served. We will honor his wishes fully. He paused, then produced a series of documents gathered by Harris and Stephen, the financial records, emails, and correspondence that exposed the conspiracy orchestrated by Margaret and Caldwell. In addition, Ethan continued, we have uncovered evidence of fraudulent activities and betrayal that threaten the integrity of this family and its future. A murmur rippled through the room as Ethan laid the documents on the lectern, the weight of the revelations sinking in. Margaret rose abruptly, her voice sharp yet controlled. This is an attempt to smear my name and seize control unjustly. These accusations are baseless and motivated by spite. Stephen Caldwell stood as well, his tone equally defensive. We demand that these allegations be subjected to proper legal scrutiny before any judgments are made. Ethan met their challenges with unwavering resolve. The evidence speaks for itself, and the law will take its course. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter, one where truth and justice prevail. The tension in the room was palpable as attorneys representing both sides exchanged formal notices, setting the stage for legal proceedings that would unravel the conspiracy. As the gathering dispersed, Ethan felt a surge of determination. The public exposure of Margaret and Caldwell's betrayal was a crucial step toward reclaiming the Langston legacy. The path ahead would be arduous, but the foundations of truth had been laid. Later, standing alone by the grand window, Ethan gazed out at the sprawling estate bathed in twilight. The mansion, once a symbol of hidden secrets and fractured loyalties, now stood as a beacon of resilience and hope. He clutched a letter from his father, its words a guiding light amid the uncertainty. The fight was far from over, but with each revelation, Ethan moved closer to justice and the restoration of his family's honor. The courtroom was alive with a tense energy that crackled beneath the veneer of formal decorum. Rows of polished wood benches were filled with a mixture of family members, legal teams, journalists, and onlookers, each bearing witness to a drama that had gripped the city's elite for weeks. The air was thick with anticipation and whispered speculation as the trial to expose the betrayal behind Victor Langston's death reached its climax. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight and unwavering. Beside him, Stephen Grant reviewed final notes, his expression a blend of focus and determination. Across the room, Margaret Langston and Stephen Caldwell sat side by side, their faces pale and taut, the weight of impending judgment pressing heavily upon them. The judge, an imposing figure of authority draped in traditional robes, called the court to order. The room fell into a hush as the prosecution began its presentation, unfolding a narrative woven from months of investigation, evidence, and testimony. The lead attorney stepped forward, projecting confidence tempered by the gravity of the case. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, he began, we present irrefutable proof that Margaret Langston and Stephen Caldwell conspired to undermine Victor Langston's legacy through financial manipulation, intimidation, and ultimately, actions contributing to his untimely death. The prosecution methodically laid out the evidence. Detailed financial records showing unauthorized transfers, emails revealing secret meetings and plans to control the family fortune, and testimonies from staff and associates who had witnessed suspicious activities. Each piece built upon the last, painting a vivid picture of calculated betrayal. Ethan listened intently, his mind a steady anchor amid the unfolding storm. The years of estrangement, the pain of loss, and the burden of legacy converged in this moment of reckoning. Margaret's defense attorney rose to challenge the accusations, attempting to cast doubt on the evidence and questioning the credibility of witnesses. Yet, the prosecution's case was thorough and relentless, anticipating each counterargument with clarity and precision. When the time came for Ethan to take the stand, he rose with a calm resolve that belied the turmoil beneath. His testimony was measured and heartfelt, recounting his relationship with his father, the discovery of the conspiracy, and the impact of betrayal on his family and future. I stand here not only as Victor Langston's son, but as the guardian of his legacy, Ethan declared. The truth must prevail, and justice must be served, for my father, for this family, and for all who believe in integrity. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Ethan's words resonated beyond the walls. His transformation from estranged son to determined heir was clear to all. As the trial progressed, witnesses were called to corroborate the evidence. Employees who had noticed irregularities, financial experts who traced the fraudulent transactions, and investigators who unveiled the web of deceit. The turning point came when Harris, the private investigator, presented a recording of a covert meeting between Margaret and Caldwell, in which they discussed plans to manipulate Victor's will and control the family business. The audio was clear, the voices unmistakable, and the intent undeniable. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Margaret's face paled, and Caldwell's composure cracked visibly. The judge called for order, his voice firm. This evidence is compelling and will be considered thoroughly. In the final moments of the trial, the prosecution summarized the case with a passionate appeal to justice. This is more than a dispute over wealth. It is a battle for truth, honor, and the preservation of a family's legacy. We ask this court to hold the defendants accountable and to restore faith in the principles Victor Langston stood for. The courtroom held its breath as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. After a brief recess, he returned, the air heavy with expectancy. Having reviewed the evidence and testimony, the court finds Margaret Langston and Stephen Caldwell guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and actions contributing to the wrongful death of Victor Langston, he declared. Sentencing will be scheduled accordingly. A wave of relief and vindication swept through Ethan. The betrayal that had haunted his family was exposed, and justice was taking its rightful course. As officers moved to escort the convicted from the courtroom, Ethan's gaze shifted to the gallery, where loyal family members and friends offered quiet congratulations. The journey had been arduous, but the truth had prevailed. Later, standing outside the courthouse beneath a sky streaked with the fading light of day, Ethan felt a profound sense of closure mingled with renewed purpose. The legacy of his father, once threatened by treachery, was now secured by truth. He vowed to honor Victor Langston's vision, not only through business, but by rebuilding the trust and bonds fractured by deceit. The battle had been won, but the work of healing and restoration was just beginning. Ethan was ready to lead the way, carrying forward a legacy forged in resilience and justice. The morning sun filtered gently through the stained glass windows of the Langston Estates chapel, casting vibrant shards of color across the polished stone floor. The air was serene, filled with the soft murmur of prayers and the faint scent of lilies and cedarwood. Ethan stood quietly before the altar, his gaze fixed on the simple, yet dignified headstone that marked his father's grave. The name Victor Langston was etched deeply into the marble, a testament to a life marked by triumphs and trials, by secrets unveiled and legacies reclaimed. The journey that had brought Ethan here was long and arduous, a path woven with grief, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Yet, standing in this sacred space, he felt a profound sense of peace settle within him. The wounds of the past, raw and painful, had begun to heal, transformed by justice and the courage to confront darkness. With deliberate care, Ethan reached into his pocket and retrieved the silver bracelet he had found among his father's belongings. A simple band, engraved with a phrase his father had once whispered, "Strength through truth." He placed it gently upon the headstone, a silent vow and a symbol of the bond that had transcended years of silence. Behind him, the soft footsteps of Julia and Stephen Grant approached. Julia's eyes shimmered with quiet pride, while Stephen's expression conveyed a respect forged through shared trials. They stood beside Ethan, united not only by blood and duty, but by the resilience that had carried them through the storm. Ethan's voice broke the silence, steady and filled with resolve. "This is no longer just a grave," he said softly. "It's a reminder of the truth we fought for, the legacy we must protect, and the future we will build." The three shared a moment of solemn reflection before turning toward the estate's sprawling gardens, where the first blooms of spring were beginning to awaken. The vibrant colors and gentle breezes seemed to herald a new beginning, a renewal of hope and purpose. In the days that followed, Ethan immersed himself in the work of restoration and growth. He took the helm of the family business with a clear vision, not merely to expand wealth, but to honor his father's philanthropic spirit, to foster transparency, and to rebuild the fractured relationships within and beyond the family. Meetings with former rivals transformed into collaborations. Bridges burnt by suspicion were rebuilt with empathy and understanding. Ethan's leadership was marked by compassion as much as by determination, a testament to the transformation he had undergone. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Ethan found himself in the estate's library, a place that had witnessed much of his journey. He opened a letter from a distant relative, extending an olive branch and expressing a desire to reconcile. Smiling, Ethan penned a thoughtful reply, embracing the promise of healing. Outside, the estate buzzed with renewed life. The laughter of children, the hum of bustling staff, and the quiet conversations of those committed to a shared future. The shadows of the past still lingered, but were softened by the light of resilience and forgiveness. As dusk settled, Ethan stood once more beneath the ancient oak tree where he had played as a child, the same tree that had witnessed both joy and sorrow. He breathed deeply, the cool air filling his lungs, and felt the weight of legacy settle into something lighter, something alive. He knew the road ahead would not be without challenges, but the courage to face them had been forged in fire. The Langston name would endure, not just because of wealth or power, but because of the truth it now represented. Ethan's journey from resentful son to compassionate leader was complete, yet also just beginning. With a final glance at the stars emerging above, he stepped forward, ready to embrace a future shaped by hope, integrity, and the unbreakable bonds of family. If you love the story, like the video and subscribe.